nature. But on with tonight's talk. Absolutely delighted tonight to talk or to hear about a year on the Lymington Keyhaven Nature Reserve. Um, Pete Donnell is a legend in his own lifetime in terms of the amount of work he's done for nature conservation in Hampshire. And he's now looking after several reserves across the county, but also is predominantly known for Lymington, Keyhaven. And you'll often see him down there um, working when he's not actually looking at the wildlife. He actually does a hell of a amount of work himself, as well as organising others to do it. But he's also a really well-known local artist and specialises in printmaking, drawing his inspiration from the natural history of Hampshire and further afield. So it's absolute pleasure to have Pete with us this evening. And Pete, over to you for your presentation.
Oh, thanks, Mike, for that very generous introduction. The checks in the post, um, yeah. As you're a natural history society, I'm sort of assuming that pretty much all of you have been to Lymington Keyhaven Nature Reserve. But if you haven't, I'm quite happy to answer questions at the end of the talk. So the nature reserve itself. It's an extensive site. This is a nice view looking across Salton's Marsh on one lovely winter's day a couple of years ago. So the reserve itself, it extends from the Lymington River in the north of this picture, right the way down to the village of Keyhaven, almost to the village of Keyhaven. On this particular map, the areas that are sort of brighter coloured, if you like, those are the areas that are the reserve owned by Hampshire County Council. And the paler areas are outside of our ownership. The reserve itself, it covers about 500 acres, so it's a fair size, certainly in the Hampshire context. It's a mixture of coastal grazing marshes, saline lagoons, scrub, a little bit of salt marsh here and there, a little bit of reed bed as well. So it's quite a nice mosaic of habitats. And what's particularly useful is that the offshore marshes, the Hampshire Wildlife Trust's Pennington Marshes Reserve, basically links to it. So everything inside the seawall is County Council owned nature reserve. Everything outside the seawall is Wildlife Trust. And the Wildlife Trust Reserve is about 1,500 acres. So the combination of the two creates just about the largest area of sort of protected coastal habitat in Hampshire. And a full gamut, really, a full range of habitats from open water, mudflats, salt marshes, coastal grazing marshes, saline lagoons. So really, really important area for all sorts of wildlife, and a very interesting area for archaeology as well. It was probably the largest area of Romano British Middle Age majors salt making in the UK. And so if you've been standing on this the marsh 500 years ago, you'd have been looking at an industrial landscape with hundreds of salterns all the way along the coast, making 5,000 to 6,000 tons of salt a year. It was a really big and significant industry. All gone now. Lymington became rich on the back of the salt. Now it becomes rich on the back of lots of sailors. But it's a an important site for archaeology as well. But I'm going to major on the wildlife tonight. And the idea is to go through the year, sort of starting in the spring, really, rather than starting the depths of winter. So there you go. That's a view overlooking the Lymington Yacht Haven and the Lymington River. Interesting, the Yacht Haven was only dug out in about 1971, 72. And they basically took out a big chunk of salt marsh and mudflat to do that. Hopefully they wouldn't be allowed to do it now. But in those days, there were no real protections for these sort of habitats. And so it was dug up and turned into a marina. The area you can see on this picture, we rather unimaginatively call it Normandy Lobe because we can't think of any other name for it. But it's a really interesting mixture of habitats. Bit of gorse, reed bed, even a bit of heather in there, and a mixture of scrub. It's the only site I know where you've got Chetty's warbler, reed warbler, and Dartford warbler all breeding side by side. So quite an interesting little spot. So that's the sort of northern end of the reserve, and at the opposite end down, we also own some big chunks of Hurst Spit, including this bit in this photograph, and you can see all the golden samphire here growing happily on the shingle. I love golden samphire 'cause it's one of those plants that flowers really late into the year. So this can still be in flower. It's probably still a few in flower now, actually. If you went out there and looked hard, you'd probably find one or two. So when most plants have gone over, golden samphire is still doing its thing. And it's quite a scarce plant nationally, but we've got a very healthy population down here. Okay, so a large part of the reserve looks a bit like this. So this is a view across Pennington Marshes, looking to the sort of northeast with the yacht haven in the distance. And you can see this whole network of ditches and channels all the way across the coastal grazing marshes. Now, it might appear that that must be the old salt industry, but actually it's not. It's what came after the salt industry. The land the salt industry basically collapsed in the middle of the 19th century. It became uneconomic because you could dig salt out of the ground up in Cheshire for next to nothing, put it on a train and ship it down to London or wherever you wanted to. So salt lost its value, and making salt from the sea became far, far too expensive and not commercially viable. So they had a vast area of low-lying coastal land which was basically polluted with salt. You couldn't grow crops on it. All you could really do was graze it with animals from the new forest. So I used to drive the animals off the forest every spring and put them down on the marsh to graze. But unfortunately, the marsh being very low lying and wet wasn't very suitable for grazing. So they installed a vast number of these drainage ditches and channels everywhere to try and get the water off the marsh as soon as they could in the spring, so it was more suitable for grazing. What is left behind is this whole network, this patchwork of small drainage channels. It probably could be 50 miles of drainage channels on this marsh. It's extraordinary how many there are, and the amount of effort it must have gone into to doing it. But it's created a perfect habitat for breeding waders and all sorts of other things. And also, we have a habit of blocking up these drains now to keep the water on as long as possible in the spring. So this is a view taken in April. And if you come down to the reserve in April, as much as a visual experience, it's also an auditory experience because there are loads and loads of lapwings all over the marsh. They love this type of coastal grazing marsh, quite damp areas from finesse, and you've got this amazing peewit call, that fantastic display, hawking over the marsh, and it's great. We've got about, it varies between 40 and 50 pairs of lapwings on the reserve every year, and they're one of the real sort of features, I would say, in the spring. But also, if you walk along the sea wall, especially sort of around Normandy area, you've got a chance of hearing something which is far more unusual in the Hampshire context, and that's the gentle cooing of a male eider trying to impress its mate. And bizarrely, we've actually got a small breeding population of eider down in the southwest Solent. We had 2 pairs this year that successfully raised young. But the males do this amazing sort of cooing. I can't really do it, but this sort of amazing coo, and it's very far carrying. You can stand on the sea wall, and this male eider will be calling several hundred meters offshore, and you'll hear it quite well. So worth looking out for, listening out for in the spring. And it's the only place in Hampshire you're gonna hear it, as well as eider. We start to get sort of spring migrants arriving. End of March, early April, the little ring plovers arrive on site and start making more little ring plovers. And beautiful, attractive birds. These usually got about 2-3 pairs on the reserve, not large numbers. But as with all plovers, they struggle to raise young because they're basically far too small and cute, and they're little snacks basically for everything. So little ring plovers, we spend a lot of time and effort trying to protect these birds and the other wading birds, breeding birds. But yeah, some years they do, some years they don't. Also, if you're lucky, a spring visit might turn up a gargany. It's an annual visitor. Some years we get quite a few, and they have bred on the site in the past. Certainly not every year, but they'll give it a go some years. So gargany, one of my favourite ducks, because they always seem to turn up at a fantastic time of year. You know, it's at that gorgeous early springtime when the first migrants are starting to appear. You've got little ring plovers, you've got a few wheatears, and you've got gargany. It's just a great time of year. Right, so this is a view looking across part of Pennington Marsh. The marshes, the lagoons, incidentally, there's a whole string of lagoons, which if you walk the seawall, you'll see just inside the seawall, there's this whole string of lagoons, starting at Normandy, it's going around Oxley, Pennington, Butts, Keyhaven, Fishtail. They're all these lagoons, and they were all basically created as borrow pits for the sea wall. When the salt industry finished in the middle of the 19th century, they suddenly had to try and stop the sea from inundating the marsh every high tide. So they decided they'd build a rudimentary sea wall, and they needed material to do that. So the nearest place was just dig it out the ground next to where they wanted to put the sea wall. So they created these lagoons just by a necessity, really, that they needed material, and that's what they did. So they've all been done for that purpose. The most recently created lagoon, Normandy Lagoon, was only dug out in 1991, but that was done for exactly the same reason. It was dug out to provide material for a much larger and enhanced sea wall. So all of these lagoons are man-made structures, and they've all been made for a purpose. Anyway, looking across this bit of Pennington Marsh, you can see there's lots and lots of gorse in flower. You've got a little bit of blackthorn in flower in the distance there. What a great time of year. You can almost smell that sort of coconut scent coming off the gorse, can't you? And the reserve has a healthy population of the classic three sort of gorse-loving birds. Stonechat, there's probably around 20 pairs of stonechats on the reserve, and you hear them chatting away in the spring. Linnets, and I wouldn't like to say how many pairs of linnets we got on the reserve, but it's a lot. Marcus Ward has done quite a bit of colour ringing down at Keyhaven, and he's found, I can't remember his ring now. I think it's well over 100 individuals he's ringed, and that's only one relatively small part of the site. And the interesting thing about linnets is they're very, very sociable birds. They love to nest with other linnets. They're not particularly territorial, so you might get one gorse bush that has half a dozen linnet nests in it, and they'll all be nesting in this one bush, and they're quite happy with that. And then, of course, in the winter, they all gather in these very large flocks feeding out on the salt marsh. And again, they're very sociable birds. Fantastic things. They've declined enormously. Linnets have declined by sort of 80% in the general farmland areas, but certainly not down on the coast where you've got sort of rough salt marsh areas for them to feed on in the winter, and you've got plenty of gorse, perfect habitat for them. So our linnet population is holding up really well, whereas other parts of the country, it certainly isn't. And then the final one, of course, is Dartford warbler. And you don't really think of Dartford warbler as a coastal bird. It's it's a bird of the heaths, but actually we do have a population. It varies from year to year between 3 and 6 pairs of Dartfords on the site, nesting wherever there's clumps of gorse, occasionally on the seawall, and very often you can get fantastic views of Dartfords at Lymington, because they're all in these sort of linear features. They can't disappear across a great bit of heathland, so they often show extremely well. And the other interesting feature about Dartfords, as you know, they're right on the edge of their range here. They're sort of a Mediterranean species, really, and they tend to suffer in very hard winters. But it tends to be slightly milder down on the coast. So Dartfords have got a better chance of surviving down at Lymington than they would have in the forest. And very often, if they've been virtually wiped out in the New Forest, there's still a reasonable population on the coast. Right. So one of our jobs in the spring is to do the wardening and monitoring of the offshore marshes and islands for the Hampshire Wildlife Trust. The Wildlife Trust don't have any staff based down in the New Forest, and so we basically do it for them. My brother's a bit of a lazy one, so he gets somebody else to do it for him. That's fairly typical. And so our first job is to go out in sort of mid-late April, put signs up on the offshore islands asking people not to land. And then we monitor for this species, black-headed gull. This is one of the main breeding species offshore. We've got about, how many was it this year? It's about 4,600 pairs. I'll have to double check that figure, but it's about 4,600 pairs this year nesting on the offshore marshes. We do know pretty accurately how many we had. It used to be, I've been working on the site now for about 22 years, and we used to have between 7,000 and 8,000 pairs. We're down to between sort of 3,000 and 4,000 pairs now, 5,000 pairs at an absolute max, mainly because of sea level rise and the fact that the sea is rising, and it's covering these salt marshes far more frequently. And so the majority of areas now are no longer suitable for nesting gulls because they get covered by a high spring tide during the breeding season, and it's no use for them at all. So The main colony now is concentrated either side of the Lymington River on Pyrewell or Pyrewell and Normandy. And here's a good example. That's a classic example of what they have to try and put up with. So black-headed gull nest there being inundated, but these gulls are obviously wise. They're probably an older pair, and they've built a fairly substantial nest. They've raised it up to keep it above the tide line, and they will probably be fine. As long as they can get through a couple of tidal cycles, they'll probably be fine. Inexperienced birds will nest lower down and they get washed out. So yeah, we are gradually losing this colony. It's gradually declining. I don't think there's a huge amount we can do about that. It's just one more consequence of sea level rise. And it's not just black-headed gulls that nest out there either. We have a decent population of Mediterranean gulls. Last year we had about 100 pairs of Mediterranean gulls. A couple of years ago we had over 600 pairs of Mediterranean gulls. So the population does fluctuate quite a lot. As you probably know, there's a very large colony down in Langston Harbour, and there's quite a large colony down in Poole Harbour. And I think we're sort of in the middle, really. So the birds, some years they like our area. Some years they might get disturbed off one of the colonies somewhere else, and they'll come in less numbers or more numbers. But as you see, they're absolutely gorgeous birds. These very, very handsome, fully white wings, black head as opposed to a brown head. Gorgeous things. And we used to have egg collectors down here until fairly recently. They only stopped egg collecting the gull colony about 5 years ago, and the reason they did that was because of these Mediterranean gulls, because we started to get quite large numbers nesting in amongst the black-headed gull colony, and the egg collectors were going out in the morning and collecting the black-headed gulls, which they had a license to do, but obviously they were collecting Mediterranean gull eggs as well, and they couldn't really distinguish between the two, certainly not at sort of 3 in the morning. And so eventually DEFRA decided that this was unsustainable, and they stopped the collection of all gulls' eggs, which is, yeah, I mean, it's the right thing to do. I personally don't think they were harming the black-headed gull population. I think that's more to do with sea level rise, but certainly the Mediterranean gulls have benefited from that. Here you go. That's us going out counting the nests, and people often say, well, how do you count a gull colony? And the answer is using pasta. So you get a little group of your mates here. Each one of you has a bag with, say, 500 bits of pasta in it. And I recommend fusilli. Fusilli is the best. So you've got 500 bits of fusilli in your bag, and you walk through the colony in a line, and you put a bit of pasta in every nest you see. And after you walk right way through the colony, putting a bit of pasta over your nest, you just work out how many bits of pasta you've got left, and that gives you your population of gull nests, which is fine. The only downside to this is that gulls absolutely hate pasta in their nests. They can't stand it. So as soon as you walk past, you're about 30 meters past, they zoom straight in. First thing they do, they're not worried about their chicks. They don't check on the chicks or the eggs. They flick the pasta out of the nest. They can't stand it. So when you finish counting a gull colony, the golden rule is never go back. Because if you walk back through the colony, you'll see loads and loads of nests without pasta in, and you won't know whether you counted them or not. Just assume you have. And the other golden rule is wear a hat. There you go. That's about the only time when black-headed gulls look quite cute. So this is a fairly typical clutch. Three fairly healthy-looking chicks. If you look very carefully at this photograph, the first 2 chicks, the closest 2, have still got the little white egg tooth on the top of the bill, the upper mandible, little tiny white point. And they use that point for basically cracking the egg from the inside. An egg is a very strong structure. It needs to be, obviously, biomechanically strong. And so when you're inside that egg, how the hell do you get out of it? And you need to be able to crack it from the inside. So that little sharp little spike is what enables them to do that. So they crack the egg from the inside, and eventually they force their way out. And after a few days, the egg tooth falls off. So if you look, the bird at the back there, it's lost its egg tooth. That's the oldest of the chicks. The adults lay an egg about every 24 to 36 hours. So you know, the chicks hatch at slightly different intervals. Yeah, so it's an exhausting process getting out of an egg. If you walk through the colony, you'll often come across a chick, and it's lying there. It's got a bit of eggshell either side of it. It's soaking wet, and it's absolutely knackered because it's just spent about an hour trying to get out of that egg. Anyway, so it's not just gulls nesting out there, med gulls and black-headed gulls. There's also populations of terns, particularly sandwich terns. And there we go. There's a nice colony of sandwich terns there, nesting on the shingle chanias at the mouth of the Lymington River. See the ferry in the background. And we had this year, actually, we had the largest ever colony of sandwich terns in the southwest Solent. We had 332 pairs on one relatively short piece of chania. They were in two main colonies, but the population has been doing particularly well, actually. Last 2 years we've had really good numbers of birds nesting, but more importantly we've had really good breeding success. So they've been raising 200-300 chicks, that colony. So they're way above where they need to be for raising chicks. So hopefully the population will continue to be maintained. They do move around a bit. They don't always nest in the same place, but we get some of the birds that we catch that we see probably come from Langston Harbour and vice versa. They sort of move around the area. I helped Marcus Ward ring some of the sandwich tern chicks this summer, and I think we ring 72 in the end. We ring 72 pulley and put colourings on them, so they were fairly obvious. And of the 72, 73 we've had, we ringed, 43 have been seen somewhere else. It's a remarkable level of observation, because sandwich terns are great. They tend to sit on posts showing their legs, and lots of birders like looking at them, and so you get lots and lots of records back for sandwich tern. And what was really fascinating was that these sandwich tern chicks, when they left the colony down here on the south coast, you'd think, well, they just head off to Africa, don't they? They spend the winter off the west coast of Africa. That's what they've done. They head down there. But not a bit of it. A lot of them headed north. We had records from Anglesey, from Lincolnshire, from northern France, from all over the place. They basically go on a little tour after they've fledged. They have a fly around, sort of take in the UK, and then eventually they head south. And I'm sure most of those, if not all those birds, are off the west coast of Africa now. But they certainly didn't go south initially. And that was something we didn't really appreciate, I think, until these colour ringing projects. So we've also got a healthy population of common terns offshore. It varies between 100 and 150 pairs. This year, however, and I'll come to this in a minute, most of these common terns, rather than nest on the offshore chanias, most of these common terns moved into Normandy Lagoon. And there's a whole series of islands in Normandy Lagoon, which I think is on the next slide. There we go. Yeah. So this is an aerial view of Normandy Lagoon. You can see these islands that were created specifically when this was dug back in 1991, 92 to provide material for the seawall. Ed Wiseman, my predecessor, and Barry Duffin designed this so that it had nice shallow margins, lots of islands, and it's been phenomenally successful. It really has. And the common terns, pretty much the entire colony of common terns, moved into Normandy Lagoon this spring. We had about 110 pairs, which is extraordinary. And the fact that the common terns moved in had consequences for another species as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these islands, lots of common terns on them, also little tern. And a couple of years ago, we had the entire southwest Solent population of little terns nesting in Normandy Lagoon. This year, a few of them went offshore as well, but they've been doing pretty well the last few years. They've been raising decent numbers of chicks. There you go. There's a picture there of one of the islands. If you're actually standing on one of the islands in Normandy Lagoon, have a look at that picture and see if you can see the sweet sight of success. Very carefully, have a look at that picture. It's quite well camouflaged. So bottom left, just left of middle in the bottom there, you might just be able to see this. I'll go back to the previous one. Here you go. Can you see it now? Just down the bottom left middle. That's why they're so difficult to see, and why we don't like people going out onto the chanias or the islands, because it would be so easy to tread on that. That's a little tern chick with a second little tern chick working its way out the egg, and you can see that little hole it's made. So we've had quite a lot of success with little terns over the last few years. And that until this year, the little terns were really our sort of star birds. You know, they were very scarce, less than 2,000 pairs in the UK, and we had a fairly healthy population until this year, of course. And then suddenly, these guys turned up, and these are roseate terns. And we've had roseate terns attempt to nest before, usually on the offshore islands, and we usually keep it fairly quiet. But this year, because all the common terns piled into Normandy Lagoon, the roseate terns followed them. Roseate terns often nest in amongst common tern colonies. And this pair of roseate terns turned up and then promptly started mating on the most prominent location on an island in the middle of the lagoon. And we couldn't really keep it very quiet. It was fairly obvious where they were. I think if you look carefully on this picture, you can actually see a slight hint of rosiness on these birds. They're absolutely gorgeous. This is when they first arrived. You said they've got this lovely sort of very pale, slightly rosy plumage, jet black bill, really very smart birds, and extremely scarce. There's about 100 pairs in the UK of roseate terns, 99 of which are on Coquet Island off the coast of Northumberland. One pair is somewhere else, and that pair was in Normandy Lagoon this year. So, yeah, this is an extremely remarkable occurrence, really. And we put a lot of effort into wardening these terns while they were on site, and it was successful. And there you go. There's a roseate tern with a chick. We had 2 chicks fledged. Hopefully, they're both all right, and they left the lagoon fairly healthily. So I'm hoping that they are now off the west coast of Africa. One thing you might notice, look at the bill on that roseate tern. It doesn't look the same anymore, does it? It looks more like a common tern's bill now, as in it's orange with a sort of black tip. And this is what happens with roseate terns. During as the breeding season progresses, the bill changes colour, and they lose that jet black sort of plumage or coloration that they had when they were in breeding plumage, and it goes more orange. But eventually, you see them again next year. It'll be black again. So yeah, that's something I hadn't realised, to be honest. I don't see a lot of roseate terns in this country, and that the bill changed colour quite so much during the period when they were actually raising chicks. Anyway, the Normandy Lagoon is also home to 6 species of breeding wader, the best site in Hampshire for breeding waders, including these guys, avocets. Now, avocets are a fairly recent addition to the site list as a breeding bird. The first pair nested about 6, maybe 7 years ago now, and the eggs were promptly stolen. They chose a terrible location on a small island in the middle of Pennington Lagoon, and it was just so obvious. You can't really hide a black and white bird. So obvious what they were doing, and sure enough, they were stolen. In fact, you could actually see footprints of someone walking out to where the nest was. Anyway, they soon sussed out that actually nesting in Normandy Lagoon was a much better idea. They nest within the electrified fence, and they're pretty safe on the islands. And they're fantastically good parents, avocets. We've got about 51, 52 pairs this year. So the numbers are going up each year. And what's great about avocets is they are incredibly aggressive to other birds. Here we go. They'll attack pretty much anything. People, cows, certainly a little egret or a grey heron is no problem. And if you get something like a great black-backed gull or a corvid or something like that flying over the lagoon, these guys are after them. So the combination of avocet and common terns, which are also incredibly aggressive, meant there was fantastic aerial cover over Normandy Lagoon throughout the breeding season. And the combination of electrified fence around the outside and all these aggressive birds nesting inside meant that other species were able to benefit from that. There we go. So things like oyster catchers, not the world's most pretty chick, it has to be said. Oyster catchers, we've got about 6 pairs of oyster catchers in Normandy Lagoon, and ring plovers. And we had 4 or possibly 5 pairs of ring plovers in Normandy Lagoon this year. I think they probably only raised about 3 chicks though, because as I said earlier, the chicks are incredibly vulnerable to predation. But they certainly benefit anyway from the aerial cover that the avocets provide. And then finally, redshank. Redshanks had an amazing year in the lagoon, and normally redshanks are, they're one of these birds that they tend to nest on in amongst scattered rush, often in quite long vegetation. The chicks are extremely difficult to see. You'll often see the parents behaving in a very distinctive way. You know they've got chicks. Trying to see the chicks, very, very difficult. One of the great things about Normandy Lagoon is you've got elevation because you can walk around the sea wall and you can look down into the lagoon. The other great thing is that the birds in there are very used to people walking past. We get about 100,000 people a year walking around the sea wall at Normandy. And so the birds are all totally used to seeing people and their dogs and all sorts of things going on the sea wall. They don't really worry too much about it because there's a moat or ditch and an electrified fence between you and them, and they feel quite safe. And so I would recommend a walk around the lagoon in sort of mid-May. Keep your eyes open, especially early and late, and you almost guaranteed to see wader chicks, including these little guys. This is a very young red-shanked chick, and I saw more of these this year, I think, than I've seen in the rest of my life put together. They were just everywhere. We think there were probably 13, 14 pairs in the lagoon, and most of them raised chicks, so they had a fantastic breeding season. I'll probably get the cutest chick of the day, but there might be another contender. You never know. Right, so we're progressing through the year. The sort of spring is over. We're in sort of high summer, really. This is a view across Butts Lagoon. Taken a few years ago, actually. The reed beds are far more extensive than this now. And we've got quite a bit of reed. This is the only area on the reserve where there's any sort of significant areas of reed. But even in high summer, you've got reed warblers singing away in there. All day long, these things will sing. And there's a healthy population of reed warblers on the reserve. Not so many sedge warblers. We've got a few pairs, but not many. They seem to be declining, possibly moving further north, and reed warblers are increasing. I spoke to Ed Wiseman, my predecessor, a few years ago, and he said when he first came to the marsh back in the 70s, sedge warblers are much more common than reed warblers. It's the other way around now, so things do change. Anyway, these birds weave an elaborate little nest in the reeds, and if they're lucky, they'll raise a couple of little reed warbler chicks. And what's amazing about these things, they're tiny. They weigh about 15 grams or something, and within a few weeks of leaving that nest, they are flying across the Sahara Desert on their own. It's amazing what these birds are capable of doing. And they may come back to the same reed bed next year if they make it back, if they can fly back across the Sahara Desert on their return journey. But of course, not every reed warbler nest actually produces reed warblers. Occasionally, they turn out the old cuckoo. And cuckoos are a constant on the reserve in the spring, and most of them, I think, are looking out for reed warblers. Probably a few of them are after meadow pipits, but most of them, I think, are after reed warblers. So they hang around on the edges of the lagoon, just watching carefully for what the reed warblers are up to. Let's talk a little bit about management of the reserve. So as the summer progresses, we're getting into the early autumn now, sort of September time. That's when we start doing our practical management. So what we're trying to achieve really is big open areas of grassland for things like returning waders and wildfowl. What they don't like is lots and lots of rush and lots of scrub because foxes and other predators can potentially hide behind them. So what they're after is really big open areas. So the site is grazed all summer. We put cattle on here in May, and they graze the whole site through the summer months. But cattle don't really control rush. They'll take the grass right down, but they don't really control rush. So we end up doing quite a lot of rush topping in September in preparation for the arrival of our winter visitors. And it's also a good time for things like wheat ears. They start passing through the reserve. We see them for a month or so in the spring and for a month or so in the autumn. And cracking things. And they'll often follow around near the tractors, often in company of whinchats and yellow wagtails and things like that that are following the cattle. Autumn or early autumn is also the time when a lot of these the wading birds return. This is a black-tailed godwit. And what's interesting about this bird is you can see it's starting to molt here. It's starting to lose its breeding plumage, this bright brick red breeding plumage, which is bizarrely enough is actually camouflage on its breeding grounds up in Iceland, but it's not much use on a wet, dull English mudflat. And so if they molt into a sort of dour, fairly brown grey winter plumage, and if you look carefully, if you look at the few feathers on the side of this bird, they're sort of just starting to appear. They are almost exactly the same color as the mud behind it, so you can see how that works as camouflage for them. And we have a population, a wintering population of 400-500 black-tailed godwits, depending on how wet the Avon Valley is or how frozen the Avon Valley is. So yeah, fantastic birds. And I've got a friend who's totally obsessed by these. He goes to Iceland every year to catch find the chicks, and we often pick up colouring birds on the reserve. Also, this is the time of year you get slightly scarcer migrants passing through. This is a wood sandpiper, and this is an annual bird, annual visitor. Usually only 2 or 3 records, but always nice things to see. And these have nested right up in the taiga up in northern Scandinavia or even Siberia, and they're heading south. They'll spend the winter down in Africa. So these don't hang about; they're literally passing through. And in some ways, you could sort of think of the reserve as a bit like an international airport. Some birds are coming up from the south and spending the time with us. Some birds are coming down from the north and spending time with us, and some birds are literally just on transit, moving through, and they stop for a few hours and then move on. And wood sandpipers are certainly one of those. Also, ospreys. So osprey sightings are becoming more regular. And if you spend a day out in the marsh in the sort of early autumn, late summer, early autumn, you've got a pretty high chance of seeing an osprey now, which 25, 30 years ago would have been amazing, and that would have been a red letter day. But ospreys are pretty regularly seen along the coast. We've obviously got nesting down in Poole Harbour now, and I suspect it won't be that long before they start nesting in Hampshire as well. So we might be seeing them even more regularly. Right, so we've moved into October now. This is a view across Normandy Lagoon, and it suddenly becomes, for a few brief weeks of the year, you get this fabulous mosaic of bright reds and oranges scattered all the way across the salt marsh. And this is Salicornia. This is there are several species of Salicornia, but one of them, I can't remember which one it is, goes this absolutely good scarlet, basically, for a brief period. It's almost like the maple forests out in New England, but on a much smaller scale. But when you've got 1 million Salicornia plants and they all go red, you get quite a spectacular sight. So this is the view, looking across the marsh. It doesn't last long, a couple of weeks, and then it's gone, and they disappear again. They're quite insignificant little plants, spend most of the year not bothering anybody. They just have this one brief period of flamboyance. I guess for me, the first sign of sort of the winter, approaching winter, is when the kingfishers start to appear on the site. They don't breed on the reserve. There isn't really any suitable nesting habitat for them, so they tend to nest inland on the rivers and canals sent in within the county, and then they come down to the coast in the autumn and they spend the winter with us, because obviously most of it is salt water, doesn't freeze, or usually doesn't freeze, and so there's food available right the way through the winter. Whereas inland, their feeding sources might well be frozen up. So kingfisher is a pretty common bird, actually. I'm always amazed though the number of people I meet on the Sea One. They say they've never seen a kingfisher, and yet they're always there. During the winter, they are pretty regular on the posts on the edge of the lagoons as you go round. So just need to learn that call, really. They're very high pitched call they make, but yeah, a lovely bird. But I suppose the first arrival of the geese really is what most people think of as the approaching winter. Brent geese, there's usually between 1.5 and 2,000 Brent geese on the reserve. and numbers are starting to build up quite nicely now. I haven't seen many youngsters yet. I don't know if anybody else has, but I'm not sure they've had much of a breeding season. But I think very often the family parties come in later, so we probably won't know until the end of the month what sort of season they had. But there don't seem to be many at the moment. So you've got Brent geese that have come down from the Taimyr Peninsula in northern Russia, and widgeon have also come from a similar direction. And some years we get about 2,000 widgeon on the reserve. It's a fabulous bird. That whistling call flying around at night. Lovely things. And pintail. Pintail is a real success story. Looking back at our figures back in the sort of 70s and 80s, a flock of 20 pintail on the reserve was a real red letter day. We get up to 300 now, 400, I suspect, some days. And it's probably the best site now in Hampshire for pintail. And why that is, I'm not entirely sure. There's plenty of suitable habitat for them. I guess the marsh is they've got plenty of lagoons to feed on, but perhaps elsewhere they're getting more disturbance. I don't know, but they certainly seem to have discovered Lymington, and the numbers are increasing. Also out on the open areas, this is on Pennington Marsh, and this is one of the reasons we get the marsh topped in sort of September time, is so that these types of birds, things like these golden plover and lapwing, feel safe to roost. Most of these birds will be feeding at night, and these plovers have got really big eyes. They've got fantastic night vision, so they'll be feeding at night. During the day, they tend to just hang around in large groups, just sort of roosting and resting up before going out again the next night. And so they require undisturbed roosting areas. They require big open areas where they can see predators coming. They're not going to get disturbed too often and use up lots of energy. And so one of the functions of the reserve is to provide just that. It's good for breeding, but it's also good for wintering. And there's usually a flock of sort of 500 to 600 golden plover on Pennington Marsh, and up to 1,000 lapwing. So again, quite spectacular. Get a peregrine go through that, and they're all over the place. Really quite a sight. Also, the reed beds. We saw those reed beds earlier in the summer when you had the reed warblers nesting in there. In the winter, they have a different cast of characters. And this is Butts Lagoon, and bearded reedling or bearded tit is more regular, to be honest, in those reed beds in the winter than it is during the summer. So feeding on the seeds in the reed heads there, and you can just see that one munching down. Also, water rails. Water rails, they're they're difficult birds to see. But the strange thing is, if we get very, very hard weather, we occasionally get a really short, sharp, hard spot when the whole marsh freezes, completely freezes. All the water is frozen everywhere. 95%, 99% of the birds leave. They disappear. They head off down to the West Country, or they might go to continental Europe. Everything goes, apart from water rails. Water rails stick it out, whatever the weather. And if you get a really hard snap, that is the time to go out and look for water rails, because they can't hide in the reeds. It's all frozen up. They're out and about, walking around on the edges of the marsh. And sometimes you get absolutely fantastic views of water rails, but it needs to be very, very cold. But they seem pretty tough. They seem to be able to survive it quite well. Also, winter is the usual time for seeing short-eared owls. That we don't get them every year, and I think Farlington is probably a better place to see them. But most years there'll be one or two birds that will hang about through part of the winter and then move on again. But yeah, one of my favourite birds. They're absolutely fantastic. And apparently they bred in Hampshire this year for the first time in a while, which is really interesting. So it's good. I think that was a part of the fact that there was so many around last winter that some of them just stuck about to breed. So great. So just to talk a little bit about management. So obviously, managing a reserve isn't all about just going out and looking at the birds. Unfortunately, if only it was. But there's quite a lot of management around the habitats. I've talked about the topping of the marshes and everything else, but we spend quite a lot of time and quite a lot of effort um, basically sorting out the infrastructure, the site infrastructure, so that it's usable and it's safe for people. We get between 300,000 and 400,000 people a year on this reserve, walking the seawall, walking the paths. It's open 365 days a year, and they take their toll. So there's, footfall and everything else damages the paths, it damages the infrastructure. So here we go. So this is taken a couple of years ago. We were just basically resurfacing one of the seawall paths, or using a contractor to do that. And so a lot of our time is taken up just maintaining the site, keeping it safe. Also repairing fences. We've got about between 25 and 30 miles of fencing on the reserve, and there's always a bit that's on the point of falling over. So we're constantly repairing and patching up fencing. This was a picture taken about 5 years ago, maybe a bit more than that now, actually, where we had a specialist contractor in, and what they were doing was installing a new fence around Normandy Lagoon. But this was a higher fence with 2 strands of electrified wire at the top, but also they attached netting to the fence and then bent the netting down on the outside so that foxes couldn't get underneath it. And this has proved enormously successful. This is quite an expensive operation. It was actually paid for by the RSPB. They paid for this because of the breeding birds inside. And really, the uptick in numbers of breeding terns and breeding waders in Normandy Lagoon has followed the installation of this fence. So really, it shows that you know predation pressure from things like foxes, particularly, is having a big impact on our ground nesting birds, and that's certainly the case in the New Forest, and that was certainly the case in this lagoon until we put this fence around, and we can pretty much keep them out now. So yeah, it's not really a question of just leaving things to their own devices. These days, you do have to intervene quite drastically and expensively to maintain populations. And I just thought I'd sort of finish up the talk really with just a few reflections about how things have changed. Um, so my predecessor Ed Wiseman, he started working down here in the sort of late 60s really, but he really sort of started on site as a warden in the early 70s. And if he'd seen one of these, he'd have had an unbelievable day, because marsh harrier was pretty much extinct everywhere apart from a few places up in East Anglia. Now we see marsh harriers every day, and they nest quite in several locations along the South Hampshire coast, not too far from the reserve, and they hunt over the reserve every day. So fantastic conservation success story. Lots and lots of marsh harriers we're seeing. Spoonbills. The first time I saw a spoonbill on the reserve, I was actually in a hammock in my back garden, and it flew over, and I fell out of the hammock. I was so excited to see the spoonbill fly over. It was fantastic. There's 16 of them on Normandy Lagoon today. So, the population of spoonbills is increasing all the time. And this is down to the fact that they've had such great success over in Holland and France. I think these were Dutch. This is a Dutch ring bird, a youngster. And I think it's only a matter of time, to be honest, before spoonbills start nesting in Hampshire as well. They're certainly nesting up in Norfolk. So we're starting to get these sort of Mediterranean species. If you add in avocets as well, great white egret. Never used to see great white egrets again. They're not as common as spoonbills, but they're becoming more common. We see them pretty regularly now. So and they as you know, they breed down in Somerset in good numbers. So things are changing. And finally, of course, cattle egret. I saw a flock of 13 cattle egrets on the reserve last year. These are ridiculous, really, compared to what we used to see. When I came here 22 years ago, all of those species were rarities on the reserve. Now they're quite regular and they're quite common. And you could say it's a great thing. It's a good thing for bird watchers, obviously, to see these quite exotic species. But there is a reason why they're here, and that is probably because the climate is ameliorating. It's becoming milder, certainly in the winter, and they're able to survive here. And we've done quite a lot of habitat management all over the country. The RSPB do lots of work in other places to make the habitat suitable for large birds like this, and cranes and things like that as well. So their populations are increasing, whereas other species, sort of farmland birds, are continuing to decline. Anyway, I will leave you, as I think it's traditional, on a sunset. There's a nice picture there, looking across the salt marshes toward, or the salt mudflats towards some salt marshes, with a few herons lurking one evening. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you've got. Cheers.
Pete, that's absolutely fantastic. If you could stop sharing the screen, so
Um,
should be down at the
hang
bottom
on.
again somewhere.
Stop. How do I stop sharing the screen? Sorry, guys, I'm not. Oh, stop share. Here we go. Yes.
There you go,
Got it.
brilliant. So unfortunately, we still don't have a lovely picture of the famous Mr. Donnell to gaze
No,
on,
no. I
but that's
don't
just
know. I'll
one of
see if I can
those
work it.
things. So, but everyone else can change to gallery view, I guess, is the most easy way of doing it. So you can see everyone that has not got themselves hidden, and we will take some questions. I'll kick off with a question, but before I kick off with a question, I'm gonna kick off by, oops, showing this book. I don't know if it's going to come into
Oh
focus,
yes.
may not. So, it's not, or at least on my screen, it's not focusing. Sorry about that. Anyhow, there's One Man's Marshes, The Birds of Lymington and Keyhaven, was written by Ed Wiseman, as Pete said, his predecessor. And it's a fantastic book because it not only does it give the history of the reserve, it then has a systematic list of the reserve. So whilst Pete was talking, I was just looking up some of the stuff about roseate terns that have been seen on the reserve previously. So that's a fantastic book, and I'll annoy Pete now by saying that it's also got some fantastic illustrations in it uh,
Ah,
by Dan Powell, another brilliant local artist. Pete isn't the
you?
only one. Um, so fantastic illustrations, fantastic words. I've put a link in the chat where you can go directly to it, but you can get a link on the Southampton Natural History website. If you're so inclined, you can even buy it on Amazon. It's about 15 quid for a copy. Fantastic book with Christmas coming up, as it were. And it's also well worth a read if you just want to take it for yourself and have a wander around Lymington. I'm going to kick off with a question, Pete, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, feel free.
And first of all, a comment on what you said. You're talking about the Brent geese. There's
Hmm.
a few of us on the meeting tonight who do a regular survey down at Leap, just down the road from you. And I know Abigail Young from Leap is on the chat as well. And obviously, we monitor the Brent geese coming into Leap. And our observation so far is exactly the same as yours. Almost no juveniles returning yet. So hopefully
Mm.
some later in the season. But the question I wanted to ask was on the roseate terns. I saw on one of the photographs of the adult that one of the adults was ringed. Um, did it come in fully ringed, or did you catch it and ring it down on the reserve?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that you saw that. I probably should have mentioned in the talk. The both of the adult birds were ringed, and they didn't have colour rings on. They just had BTO rings or silver or metal rings, not BTO rings, metal rings. And we've got various local photographers who've got some absolutely amazing kit, and they spent half the summer basically photographing the birds from every angle they possibly could. Eventually, they managed to blow up the photographs to such an extent they could read the metal ring, which is absolutely amazing. And they got the ring number, and they managed to trace out that both the birds were actually ringed on Rockabill, which is an island off the coast of Ireland. It's the largest roseate tern colony in Europe. Actually, there's about I think I can't remember what it is. It's about 2 to 3 thousand pairs over there. I think it's a lot. Anyway, so both these birds were ringed as chicks on Rockabill in I think 2018, 2019. So they're about 4 or 5 years old. I suspect they're the same pair that's been trying to nest down at Lymington for the last 3 years, and they failed the last 2 years for a variety of reasons. They finally came into the lagoon and they succeeded. So it's really interesting that you've got this very successful colony in Ireland, which is it's, the island is not very big, and I suspect it's probably reached capacity. So it's these chicks, these birds, these young birds are now moving out and going elsewhere to try and establish their own colonies. And fingers crossed, they will come back next year and try and nest in the lagoon again, and maybe even their youngsters as well will come back, or they'll meet up with some youngsters from elsewhere. So that it does show you how much these birds move around now. Both the parents came from Rockabill. We thought they might have come from the colony up in Coquet, but no, they were identified.
Excellent. Okay. Any questions from anyone else? You can either type something into the chat, or if you use the react button at the bottom of your screen, you can raise a virtual hand, or you can just wave, or you can unmute yourself and shout at me, whichever is the most convenient way to get a question asked. Unless you have no questions at all.
Oh, they're dumbfounded.
You may well have done. It was a really brilliant, comprehensive talk, though.
Mike, I just wondered if I've got a question. It's Mary.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you have any concerns, Pete, about dogs actually out on the mud flats, and if you're able to take any action to reduce the damage they do.
Well, I do have concerns about people letting their dogs run around on the mud flats. I mean, in reality, it looks bad because they do disturb birds, and it's extremely annoying. And in the great context of what is the main threat to these species, there, disturbance is relatively minor. Loss of high tide roost sites, loss of breeding habitat, all these other things are far more important. But you're right, it's extremely irritating when someone lets their dog run around there. The truth is, there's not a huge amount we can do. We've got 5 miles of sea wall, and people, as I say, we've got 400,000 visitors a year. If you only have 1,000 of those that are antisocial with their dogs, you've got 1,000 dog incidents every year, and dogs do cause more. I get more complaints about the behaviour of dogs and dog owners than anything else. Cycling is second. Bird watching is quite low down the list, which is good to hear. So yeah, it's a problem, but everybody knows how they should behave. They should pick up after their dog. They shouldn't allow their dog to chase wildlife. Some people just don't do it, and you can put lots of signs up, and people will just ignore them. In fact, bizarrely, we put up signs in the spring explaining about breeding birds and everything else, and saying, please keep your dog on a lead. And we put other signs up explaining other things about the site, bit of information about what you can see on the site. The only signs that ever get ripped down are the ones related to dogs, and so asking dog owners to do something, look up, keep their dog on a lead. Those signs get trashed all the time, because people don't like to be told what to do with their dog. So it's a problem, but I think it's possibly getting better. I don't know. We're just getting more people, and when you've got more people, you've got more dogs. So it's tricky.
Yeah. So in terms of the egg collectors that you had problems with picking up the old Medgull egg, the licenses they had to collect black-headed gulls, what those licenses actually for? Was it to control the breeding population, or was it for eating?
No, they were collected for food. So this was a license that was issued by DEFRA. It was an official license. I think there is still one license that's issued every year for, I think it's an island somewhere up in Cumbria, where they've got a population of black-headed gulls, and I think they are still collected commercially for food. And what was interesting, they had, the license was quite specific, so they could collect every egg they could find in the colony until the 15th of May every year, but they weren't allowed to collect any after the 15th of May. And most of the people that did the collecting were actually fishermen most of the year, but then for 1 month of the year they went out and they collected gulls' eggs, and they've been doing it since the 1950s, when the colony first started to form here. And I spoke to one of them. He said he makes about 1/3 of his annual income in that 1 month just collecting gull eggs, because he could sell them to Fortnum and Masons and Harrods and places like that for about £2 or £3 an egg. So they were worth a lot of money to these guys. And the interesting thing was that, they were collecting every gull egg until about the 15th of May. They then stopped. Most years, the gull colony was wiped out by a high spring tide at the end of May. And so almost what they'd done prior to that was almost an irrelevance, because the colony had to start from scratch anyway. But it was only really when we started getting Mediterranean gulls in the colony that, because they're Schedule 1 breeding species, that Natural England decided to basically stop it. So yeah, it's quite a complex picture, because when I first came down here, I heard about this egg collecting. I thought that was disastrous. That's terrible. But actually, the egg collectors, one thing they used to do, because it was a financial asset to them, they used to control the foxes on the Pywalk side of the river. So they would control foxes that were going out and feeding, taking out the gull colonies. And as soon as they no longer had a commercial interest in it, they didn't do any fox control anymore, and we've had to do that ourselves. So yeah, these pictures are always slightly more complex than they might appear initially. But it's stopped now, and I think, yeah, I mean the gull colony is going to go anyway eventually, because the marshes will get washed out. But it won't be through egg collecting that the colony is lost.
So he's just dropped into the chat that another place you might be able to see kingfishers very close to you is in the seawater Lido down at Lymington.
Oh yeah, I know, yeah.
So if you want to relax and see kingfishers at the same time, that might be a place to go.
Lovely down there, lovely.
Any other questions? I can't.
Hand. There's a hand there.
Is there a hand? Sorry.
Oh, is it my hand? Oh, it might be my hand, actually. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that's my hand.
Yeah, very good, Pete. We can't see you, but you can see yourself. That's brilliant. Okay, well, I think that probably brings us to the end then.